people have seen the Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which I highly recommend, by the way, 20,000 years ago they were painting and using the 3D effects of the cave walls to enhance their painting and what it meant to these early humans. So if you can transport yourself back 20,000 years to a cave, you can somewhat maybe appreciate the three-dimensional nature of the slideshow here. Apart from the exit sign, although it seems like perhaps we should be running for the exits these days, unfortunately we don't have another planet to live on. So I just put this slide up there. I don't have that many slides, but so you don't have to crane your neck too much. But I think this slide gives a pretty good representation of just how enormous the Hurricane Sandy was and the extent that it covers the whole of the North American continent pretty much, 1,000 miles across. Quite a spectacularly large, unprecedented in many ways, confluence of a hurricane from the Gulf with another climate system coming across from the Arctic. Generally, most scientists now saying that the reason that it headed inland this late in the year, which is pretty unusual, is because the record ice melt in the Arctic that created warm seas and then pushed what would otherwise have gone out to sea under normal circumstances back inland. And of course the reason that it was so large in the first place and so ultimately terrifying is because of the unusually hot weather that has created very warm oceans in the South Pacific, the Atlantic, and has enhanced the ability of the atmosphere to hold more moisture. And of course, if the place is hotter in the first place, then it means that it's carrying more energy. All of these things, essentially everything that we're doing to warm up the climate is creating feedback loops which are enhancing the strength of these storms. And so this, as many people are now arguing, is really the shape of things to come. And climate change is not a future concern, but a contemporary concern. And however, if you go to the next slide, this is a three-dimensional map created in 2007, so 5 years ago, of what would happen if the seas rose by about 3 meters. And the blue areas are all of the areas that have flooded. So 3 meters is about 9-10 feet, which is exactly what Sandy created. And so 5 years ago, what was predicted to happen with a sea level rise of 10 feet actually happened, pretty close to what the scientists had predicted at that time. So we can't say that there was no possibility that we were not warned, because if you read about Hurricane Irene, which was just about exactly a year ago, you find out that Hurricane Irene came within about 6 inches of doing the exact same in terms of inundating the subways, flooding the tunnels, and all of the other kind of chaos and mayhem that we're still suffering from today. And obviously tens of thousands of people still without electricity, still without water, and trapped all across not only this state but also New Jersey. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the warnings that we kind of had and some of the things from, if you've read the 2 articles that I wrote that became pretty widely distributed in the wake of the hurricane. Then I'll talk a little bit about that, but I'm also going to talk about what the solutions are, both from a mainstream perspective, what they're talking about, and then move on to why they are either actively detrimental to both us and the planet and will not solve the problem, or just simply they're just not up to the scale of the problem as it currently exists. So in contrast, I want to talk a little bit about, go into what would it look like if we could actually control and run things. What would New York City look like if we were the ones making the decisions about how to make it resilient to climate change, how to prevent climate change from happening to the extent that we still can? And what would our lives look like under those kind of circumstances? So I want to begin with, I think, Karl Marx has a lot of great writing, of course, and unbeknownst to many people, a lot of great writing on environmental issues too. But I'm going to start with a speech that he made at the anniversary of the People's Paper in 1856, because I think it speaks to, and people will probably understand that it speaks to our situation right now. On the one hand, there have started into life industrial and scientific forces which no epoch of the former human history had ever suspected. On the other hand, there exist symptoms of decay far surpassing the horrors recorded in the latter times of the Roman Empire. So, despite the celebratory atmosphere of what Marx was doing at this time, the anniversary of the People's Paper, he is trying to capture, in quite somber mood really, the dialectical contradictions between society as it currently is and society as it could be, and the social contradictions that are given rise to by the nature of capitalism. Does society move forwards, or does it regress backwards? And he had seen the defeat of the Chartist movements of the 1830s. He'd seen the defeats of the revolutions in Europe of 1848. And so he was reflecting on this. And the 1850s were a period of reaction where he delved back into his academic studies in major ways, and 10 years later produced his masterwork, Capital. So he goes on. In our days, everything seems pregnant with its contrary. Machinery, gifted with the wonderful power of shortening and fructifying human labor, we behold starving and overworking it. The newfangled sources of wealth, by some strange, weird spell, are turned into sources of want. The victories of art seem bought by the loss of character. At the same pace that mankind masters nature, man seems to become enslaved to other men or to his own infamy. Even the pure light of science seems unable to shine but on the dark background of ignorance. All our invention and progress seem to result in endowing material forces with intellectual life and in stultifying human life into a material force. This antagonism between modern industry and science on the one hand, modern misery and dissolution on the other hand, this antagonism between the productive powers and the social relations of our epoch is a fact, palpable, overwhelming, and not to be controverted. Written 150 years ago, I think that set paragraph resonates even more strongly with our current situation. The decay and social contradiction that Marx spoke about that was taking place in Europe has now spread to planetary proportions, to the extent that entire ecosystems are becoming dismembered, and beyond that, the climate system of the biosphere is starting to fracture from its relatively benign and stable state over the last 12,000 years or so into one that is unrecognizable to us, or will be unrecognizable to human civilization, because the last 12,000 years or so of a stable climate happened to have coincided with the rise of civilization. If you cannot predict the weather and the climate, when it's going to rain, where it's going to rain, and how much, then suddenly you can't grow crops. In other words, you can't have agriculture. And so clearly this would be a major problem to us staying alive, seeing as we require food. The nightly news, as we've seen, is often a maelstrom of horrendous weather events. Clearly, Hurricane Sandy is a contemporary and very relevant and most immediate example of that. In terms of what Marx was talking about in the Communist Manifesto, separately, I think the never, as one of his comments seemed so apt, modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer, who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he is called up by his spells. And as I mentioned, it was only a year ago that we saw Hurricane Irene right here, the evacuation of 370,000 people, the devastation of Vermont and New Hampshire. That cost $16 billion to fix. who knows how much this current disaster is going to cost. There are some estimates now of $50 billion, which would put it second to Katrina, because New Orleans is estimated to have cost so far the U.S. economy $250 billion. Last year there were 14 different incidents, weather-related, climate-induced incidents of damage to various different parts of the U.S. economy, costing $1 billion each. And even as we're flooded here and overwhelmed by the oceans, the rest of the United States is in the biggest drought we've experienced since the 1930s, and is still in that drought. And so as much as the East Coast is underwater, the rest of the country is absolutely devastated, to the extent that the barges along the Mississippi are running aground and having to actually load less onto them because the river is so dry. The Great Lakes region, the boats are running aground because they are forced to carry less goods in, so that the ships aren't so low down. But nevertheless, if you go to the next slide, this kind of situation is raising a lot of questions for scientists, at least, and they're becoming ever more vocal in the problem that this will engender. So the bulletin, you will be surprised to know, perhaps, I don't know, there really is a doomsday clock, and there are a bunch of scientists who keep control of it and move it backwards and forwards towards or away from midnight. At one point it was in the 1980s 2 minutes to midnight, and they'd moved it back. But now, as a result specifically of the inability of politicians to do anything about climate change, they have now moved it forward to 5 minutes to midnight. And so this is obviously a particularly scary scenario that we're talking about. If you go to the next slide, according to the International Energy Agency, the US government agency, this is from a year ago, if they carry on building fossil fuel infrastructure as they are doing, then we are heading for irreversible climate change within the next 5 years. Now it's 4 years. And there's no situation, it seems, that is bad enough to compel them to change course, or to compel capitalism to change course, because currently we are burning around about 80 million barrels of oil every single day, which is, when you just think about that one number, a quite remarkable statistic. 80 million barrels of oil, a barrel is about 44 gallons like this, every single day of the year. 80 million, 80 million. So that is being extracted from the earth every day and refined into various other products, including gasoline. But by 2020, that is projected to rise, not fall, rise to 110 million barrels of oil. So we have 5 years to start radically decreasing it, but in the next 8 years or so, they're predicting that it will increase to 110. Predominantly a lot of that coming from the United States, as it happens, that I'll talk about in a second. And so this kind of scenario is certainly driving more and more scientists to argue that we need to go beyond just explaining the science, to actually talk about putting our bodies on the line and trying to build a movement that will act against the corporations, act against the politicians who are doing nothing except whatever the politicians essentially tell them to do. So James Hansen, NASA's the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at this place, Columbia, recently wrote in the Washington Post, "Our analysis shows that it is no longer enough to say that global warming will increase the likelihood of extreme weather, and to repeat the caveat that no individual weather event can be directly linked to climate change. To the contrary, our analysis shows that for the extreme hot weather of the recent past, there is virtually no explanation other than climate change." And then when you think about the heat wave in 2010 in Russia that killed thousands of people, the droughts in Texas and Oklahoma last year Texas eastern Texas had 2 inches of rain for the whole year. Even drought-resistant organisms couldn't really survive. So he goes on, the odds that natural variability created these extremes are minuscule, vanishingly small. To count on those odds would be like quitting your job and playing the lottery every morning to pay your bills. I'm not sure how much people want to go into some of the science behind to what extent Hurricane Sandy was created or exacerbated by climate change or not. There's a lot of good stuff coming out that's been written in many of the popular scientific press, including Scientific American. I'll just quote David Bielo, his associate editor at Scientific American. Global warming didn't spawn Sandy, but it certainly contributed to the impact, with a couple of features definitely worsening it. Higher sea surface temperatures have made the storm surge stronger. Normally, hurricanes come up to the coast and turn right back into the ocean. But as a consequence of the major meltdown of Arctic sea ice this summer, there was a weather pattern preventing Sandy from taking that course, and it steered back onto land. Many weather records, as people will have probably read about, were broken in 2012 all over the country. There were 38 million people in 2011 displaced by climate-related events in just 2 countries, China and Pakistan. So the idea of climate refugees, millions of climate refugees, now we can add New York to those, and people in New York City to that growing list of people, because over the last, from the industrial period to now, the world has warmed by about 0.8 Celsius. New York has actually warmed a little bit more than that, by 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. The oceans, it's been pretty well recorded down at Battery Park for over 100 years now what the level of the ocean is, and that has increased by 12 inches over the last 100 years, so about an inch a decade, and that's accelerating. So what that means is if we're already a foot higher than we were, normally even fairly minor storm surges are becoming problematic, and obviously will become increasingly problematic as this process continues, because there's a time lag with regards to climate change. The effects that we're feeling now are from the CO2 that was put out in the 1950s to the 1970s. And so the last 40 years or so of CO2 output, which has been far larger, we haven't even started to experience. So we are at the very beginning of a process which it has a potential to become exponential. And that is now what many scientists are now saying, that we've completely underestimated the various feedback loops. And so rather than a linear process, it's going to be an exponential or a curved process. So it will no longer be proportional, which is, of course, very scary. A recent report out by PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the world's largest accounting firms, said the report was titled, "Are We Too Late for 2 degrees?" So 2 degrees Celsius is what is regarded as kind of the cutoff point for when things start getting out of control. We lose our ability to really control our own future, because once you get to 2 degrees, you kind of then head towards 3 and 4 and so on and so forth. So this accountancy firm, actually it's here, it is a report, details to what extent we may not be able to do that, but essentially not because we don't have the answers, but because nobody's really doing anything about it. And so one of the partners of Price Waterhouse, so not a socialist by any means, one of the writers of the report, Leo Johnson, said, "This isn't about shock tactics, it's simple maths. We're heading into uncharted territory for the scale of transformation and technical innovations required in order to prevent disaster, because we're on track for a 4 degrees Celsius increase in average global temperatures, and that would be warmer than any period in the last 30 million years. So that is obviously something completely unheard of, which is possibly why Bloomberg decided to have this put on the front of his magazine, which is about the most useful thing he's done probably since he became mayor. But we're approaching a situation where, on the other hand, the next set of climate negotiations in 2.5 weeks' time or so, Doha, Qatar, which they couldn't have chosen a better place for it, really, a petro-state dictatorship that was artificially carved and put in place for the imperial interests of the great powers. I hardly think it's the 20th year of climate negotiations, and clearly they have gone nowhere so far, so it'll be interesting to see if Hurricane Sandy plays any part in their deliberations, because the pledges so far are totally inadequate. If the US was to live up to its pledge of cutting by 17% its CO2 emissions based on a 2005 baseline, which is what everybody else says you shouldn't do, right? Everybody else is like 1990, that's when we're going to start our baseline from. The US is like, no, we're going to start from 2005, because obviously that gives us much more leeway, and we're going to cut it by 17%. But if they did that over the next few years, over the next 3 to 4 years, they'd have to close every single coal plant in the United States. And obviously they're not talking about doing that. So in fact, coal exports under Obama are the largest they've ever been, because we're now exporting more and more coal, because we're fracking the entire country for natural gas. We're exporting more coal to China and India than we've ever done before. So the coal industry is doing very well from its exports. The natural gas industry is doing very well from fracking the country, which kind of gives a lie to the idea that natural gas could ever be some kind of transition fuel or bridge to the future, because basically they will burn everything that they possibly can. And of course then the US state gets to blame China and India for building more coal plants by burning the coal that we sent over there. So clearly none of this is really anywhere close to being adequate, and we are in the middle of experiencing some of the outcome of that. An article published in Nature Climate Change in early 2012, this year, said, struck by many intense hurricanes in recorded history and prehistory, New York City is highly vulnerable to storm surges. We show that the change of storm climatology will probably increase the surge of risk for New York City. The combined effects of storm climatology change and a 1 meter projected sea level rise may cause the present New York City 100-year surge flooding to occur every 3 to 20 years, and the present 500-year flooding to occur every 25 to 240 years by the end of the century. So obviously we've already had 2 in 2 years. So even this more recent estimate may be underestimating, not saying we're going to have it again next year, but clearly this is part of a trend. There are 100 million Americans who live in coastal areas within 3 feet of sea level. So it's Boston, Miami, 100 million people live within 3 feet. 200,000 people in this city live within 4 feet of high tide. And so obviously all of those people are currently displaced. Now, it's not just me or it's not just scientists saying that we're beginning to have a problem. Some of the large insurance companies are similarly sounding the alarm. So that there was a report released by Munich Re, which is one of the largest reinsurance companies in the world, in a report titled Severe Weather in North America, says, nowhere in the world is the rising number of natural catastrophes more evident than in North America. While many factors have contributed to this trend, including an increase in the number of people living in flood-prone areas, the report identified global warming as one of the major culprits. Climate change particularly affects formation of heat waves, droughts, intense precipitation events, and in the long run, most probably also tropical cyclone intensity. Or as 3 senior climate scientists put it, we'll probably never know the exact point when the weather stopped being entirely natural. but we should consider Sandy and other recent extreme weather events an early taste of a climate-changed world and a grim preview of the even worse to come, particularly if we continue to pump more carbon pollution from smokestacks and tailpipes into the atmosphere. Now, of course, there is another way of viewing climate change, not as a catastrophe that we're in the middle of causing, but as an opportunity for business. And so you can definitely expect to hear a lot more in New York about P3, public-private partnerships, whereby contracts will be given to private companies to take over, essentially, what were previously public services and run them in the interest of profit. They've got a template to work from there, New Orleans, with the privatization of that city and the reorganization of the population. You can also, I think, we've already heard Obama, he's only just got elected, but he's already talking about the fiscal cliff, whereas actually what we're facing is a carbon cliff. So you can expect to hear a lot more about that and how we need to cut more social services, more public spending for a slight change in the taxes to the rich. But there's lots of opportunities for business in terms of rebuilding New York City along privatized lines, as was highlighted by Ian Murray of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, who was writing in Forbes. His article is titled Hurricane Sandy and the Invisible Hand of Disaster Recovery. So we're going to be saved. We have a problem in New York, according to this article, Ian Murray, in that the reason that we rejected, because we rejected big box stores like Walmart and so on, this is going to make us less capable of recovery, because corporations like Walmart are just itching to go and help people in emergency situations. If only we would let them into our city. Secondly, the other thing that's really preventing us from recovering from Hurricane Sandy, in his opinion, is that we have too strict union regulations. So there are laws here that say that you have to pay the prevailing local rate, which is above minimum wage, rather than minimum wage. And this is really hindering the ability of us to recover from the storm. So to quote him, disaster response provides an excellent example of how the invisible hand of the market works to alleviate suffering and bring quick relief to those in need. Big box stores also don't merely sit and wait. They get out first and help people. It will be interesting to see whether the lack of big box stores in Manhattan has any effect on the speed of the recovery there. Mom and pop stores simply can't do what big box stores can in these circumstances. So they're basically a humanitarian service that you probably didn't realize up till now. Big government, on the other hand, can get in the way. The cleanup process might be hindered by pro-union rules, such as the Davis-Bacon Act, which increases the cost of federally funded construction projects. So churches, individuals, and for-profit corporations are really the people who are going to step in to the void that he hopes will be vacated by big government that just kind of gets in the way. And the only role that he sees for big government is the military and the police overseeing and making sure that property rights are held sacrosanct, and you can stand on a street corner, or Walmart can go in and sell whatever they want for whatever price they want in these devastated areas, and the police and the military will protect them. That is how he sees it. Or Russell Sobel, who's wrote a piece in New York Times Room for Debate, quote, a FEMA that established free trade zones in which all normal regulations, licensing and taxes were suspended, and in which buyers and sellers felt secure and protected, would better provide the goods and services victims need. So we should have free trade zones in the affected areas where you can buy and sell at any price you want, and not as a service to the people there, but as a way of making money from people desperate and in need. Government should stick to what it does best, and creating a distribution network overnight superior to Walmart's isn't it. After a disaster, government is and must be a productive and important part of the process, just as it is every day in our economy, by ensuring the presence of the two things decentralized markets need to work effectively: unregulated prices and secure property rights. In other words, a complete free-for-all in terms of the market, but then the police there to make sure they can buy and sell stuff. So, and Naomi Klein had a piece in The Nation critiquing what will be seen as an opportunity for them to make money from climate change-induced disasters. To quote her, post-Sandy, upscale real estate agents are predicting that backup power generators will be the new status symbol with the penthouse and mansion set. It seems that for some, climate change is imagined less as a clear and present danger than as a kind of spa vacation. Nothing that the right combination of bespoke services and well-curated accessories can't overcome. That at least was the impression left by the Barney's New York pre-Sandy sale, which offered deals on Sencha green tea, backgammon sets, and $500 throw blankets so its high-end customers could, quote, settle in style. Yeah. If you go to slide 4, this is what I mentioned earlier. These are the predictions for the very bottom line there. The yellow line is what we need to do to stabilize at 2 Celsius. The red line is what the predictions are for where we're headed to in terms of new production of oil. So the oil giants are investing, or did invest over the course of this year, $600 billion in exploration and investigation of new oil reserves. So they are not backing down from making sure that we drill everywhere all the time, forever, as long as it lasts. If you go to the next slide. And a new report, Oil, the Next Revolution, highlights, this is out of Harvard Business School, highlights exactly the opportunities that are in place for the oil industry. So if you go to the next slide. What's that going to mean? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, oil growth is going up. The United States is on track to become the new Middle East, to quote a Citibank report, and it will lead to, as ever under capitalism, new geopolitical consequences and a continued fight over where the oil is going to be and access to it. Going to the next slide. So this is actually the Citibank, this is their cover photo of the United States with an oil derrick in it, basically saying that we can become the new Middle East by our extraction of fossil fuels. So I don't think there's any real sense in the perspective that capitalism will alter, and it's not just about the individual corporations. Obviously, some of them are directly tied to the production of oil, but it goes much beyond that. So if you go to the next slide, I think everybody's favorite monster. I'm not sure when this guy's going to die, but we should have a big party when he does. A quote from 1970. Obviously, Kissinger being the archetypal realpolitik exponent in terms of how do you make sure that your country is prepared imperially to enact and be successful at interstate competition, otherwise known as imperialism. So, amazingly enough, of course, none of this was mentioned during the recent election. Climate change never crossed Obama's or Romney's lips, for that matter. And in fact, that was a decision, as I reported and was reported in The Guardian, that was taken by the White House in 2009, that they would stop using the term climate change. Not only did the Democratic Party say that they were going to stop doing that because it wasn't a vote winner, many of the large green environmental groups went along with it. So the Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth, the Environmental Defense Fund, and also Bill McKibben of 350 were at that meeting and agreed not to use the word climate change. They were only going to talk about clean energy. Now, what is the problem with that? Well, if you're going to try and argue for a redirection of the economy towards spending money on solar power, wind power, etc., as opposed to continuing to subsidize oil and gas corporations, if you can't mention the reason for why you would want to do that, it kind of makes your whole argument impossible to make. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So for the last 2 years, we've gone backwards in terms of climate change and the national debate because of the decision that was taken by the Democrats, not the Republicans. And I think that that's really important. It's also important to point out how many of the large environmental groups went along with that idea. Of course, it's also important to remember that Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize, as if that isn't sick enough, while he's prosecuting drone wars, while he's restricting civil liberties, while he's interdicting whistleblowers, while he's deporting more people in 4 years than George W. Bush did in 8 years, and also while he increased the military budget for nuclear weapons above what was prevalent under George Bush in 2007. So we're spending more on nuclear weapons than under George W. Bush, thanks to Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize winner. Meanwhile, Shell and Exxon made $54 billion in profit in 2012. That's in 1 year, $54 billion. In exchange, they received from the US government $800 million in tax breaks and incentives, as if they were not making enough money to start off with in the first place. And as people may have heard, Con Edison actually made a prediction of how much money they would need to spend to make their system safe from the kind of things that happened in Lower Manhattan with the exploding substation. So to make submersible electrical switches and to move their high voltage power stations above ground. They costed that out 3 years ago at $250 million. They didn't spend it. They spent 1/10 of that. They spent $25 million, which if they'd spent it, may have prevented the blackout in Lower Manhattan, for example. But last year, Con Edison made $1 billion in profit. It's simply more profitable just carry on spending money and rewarding your investors than it is in building some climate resilience into your systems that they themselves had said was necessary. Now, Rex Tillerson, who's the CEO of Exxon, had this to say about climate change. In the IPCC reports, when you predict things like sea level rise, you get numbers all over the map. If you take what I would call a reasonable scientific approach to that, we believe those consequences are manageable. They do require us to begin to spend more policy effort on adaptation. But that's something that we're good at. It's an engineering problem and it has engineering solutions. There are more people being dramatically affected because they don't have access to fossil fuels to burn. They'd love to burn fossil fuels because their quality of life would rise immeasurably, just like our quality of life has risen immeasurably. Go to the next slide. Which makes you realize that this is a system that doesn't have an off switch in any real sense of the term. If you go to the next slide, this is what they get up to if you allow them. So those 5 corporations managed to make $546 billion from 2005 to 2010, while firing 11,200 workers. So it's not as if these corporations even create jobs. Which leads me to quote Eduardo Galeano: "Crimes against people, crimes against nature. The impunity enjoyed by the masters of war is shared by their twins, the voracious masters of industry, who eat nature on earth and, in the heavens, swallow the ozone layer. The most successful companies in the world are the ones that do the most to murder it. The countries that decide the planet's fate are the same ones that do their best to annihilate it." And I think that small excerpt from Galeano really illustrates for socialists the dual nature of exploitation under capitalism. That it's not just that we are exploited, right? It was bad enough when we found out that they exploit and oppress us. Now we find out that the other side of the coin of exploitation is the exploitation of the natural world, which Marx talks quite a bit about. But now we're finding out the limits to which the world and the planet can absorb before it starts moving into a completely different climatic zone, the one that we've never experienced before. So the exploitation that goes on in the social world under capitalism is really the mirror image of the exploitation that goes on in the natural world. And that, I think, was captured by Marx in Volume 1 of Capital, where he talks about, quote, capitalist production disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth, i.e., prevents the return to the soil of its constituent elements consumed by man in the form of food and clothing. It therefore violates the conditions necessary to lasting fertility of the soil. The social combination and organization of the labor processes is turned into an organized mode of crushing out the workman's individual vitality, freedom, and independence. Moreover, all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art, not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards ruining the more long-lasting sources of that fertility. The more a country starts its development on the foundation of modern industry, like the United States, for example, the more rapid is this process of destruction. Capitalist production, therefore, develops technology only by sapping the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker, which I think beautifully encapsulates the exploitative nature, socially and naturally, that we currently experience under capitalism. Now, on the one hand, we've had the election, and we can be glad, I suppose, that, go to the next slide, no, the one before that, that Romney lost. But on the other hand, what can we really expect from an Obama administration in his second term? And I would argue, just like Clinton, less than his first term, in fact, not more, less. Scientific American had an editorial titled Climate Change Action and More Drilling Likely in Obama's Second Term. We know Obama's already boasted several times about how much oil pipeline he's managed to lay. President Barack Obama secured a second four-year term in yesterday's vote. What is the likely outcome of that historic event on energy and environmental issues? Simply put, more of the same. So there you have it. Let me move on to, I guess, talk a little bit about what some solutions might be from this insanity. Just to give you one more statistic of how crazy this world is. In 2010, the US military spent $20.2 billion in Iraq and Afghanistan on air conditioning alone. So they costed, sea defenses for this city at $10 billion. Something that one person in this city, who shall remain nameless, could probably, in fact certainly, afford, and still, in fact, be a multi-billionaire, right? Bloomberg is valued at $25 billion. So if he really wanted to be seen as a human being, as opposed to an ultra-rich parasite, as his legacy, then he could donate $10 billion, sort out the city for future generations of New Yorkers, and still it would not even be noticed in terms of his personal wealth, because he would still have $15 billion to himself, and 12 houses, by the way. He just bought his fourth house in Westchester. He owns 3 in Manhattan, and 1 in Colorado, 1 in Florida, 1 in Bermuda, 1 in London. It must be difficult to know where to evacuate to in a hurricane. And moving on to, the number of things that we need doing in New York City is quite staggering. According to the city's own reports, only 41% of our bridges are in good repair. We know we only recycle, according to the city, 15%. Not that recycling is anything, but anything serious in terms of what we need to do. But the city says we only recycle 15%. You've probably seen these things around the city. Go to the next slide. not the Muppets. You've probably seen them too. But at any, you don't need to necessarily read it. You can go to any sewage outlet along the Hudson or the East River and see these signs that are telling you that raw sewage gets pumped into the rivers at any kind of somewhat minor storm. Any kind of level of rain overwhelms the sewage system, and so it has to go straight into the rivers and the oceans. Imagine what we could do as some kind of alternatives, as was even reported in the New York Times, in terms of replanting oyster beds around the city instead of the islands that disappeared due to dredging, put those back in place. In terms of, I mean, if you accept that there's only 8.2% unemployment, then that's still 500,000 people in New York City alone without jobs. How could we put them back to work? Well, there are lots and lots of obvious things that could be done in terms of making this city more climate resilient and a more beautiful place too, where we can have wildlife coming back and so on. How can we reinstitute the salt marshes that used to be out? How can we make sure that we don't overdevelop the coastlines and pull back from that? And some of that was actually in the New York Times article that people probably read. But what direction are we going to go in? Actually, we're going to go, obviously, unless without any kind of social pressure, we're going to go in the direction of more privatization, more short-term building, and more concrete. Because you build stuff with concrete, and obviously everything goes, washes away, and you're completely wasting whatever it is we're talking about. If you go to the next slide, just to give you some kind of idea of what's possible, as it says there, the energy reaching from the Earth from the Sun is 101,000 terawatts. The world currently uses 15 terawatts. And so we would only have to capture a tiny fraction of the solar energy falling on the Sun in order to provide for world energy use. Now, I'm not saying we would do that because we would want to plan things out and have a mix and so on and so forth, but it just gives you, with that one statistic, I think, an idea of what's really out there, as if we don't have answers already. On the other hand, if you go to the next slide, this is kind of what they're spending it on. Overwhelmingly, they're spending money on nuclear power. But nuclear power is going to become, not only is it dangerous, not only do we produce waste that lasts for 600 generations into the future, that we have no idea what we're going to do with, and it leads to nuclear weapons proliferation and all kinds of other things. And what would have happened if some problem had occurred with Indian Point, which is 25 miles from here, while nobody could cross the bridges? Then not only all of those things, but nuclear power itself and thermoelectricity like coal plants and so on are much more vulnerable to climate change because they rely on cooling from the rivers. Well, if the rivers have dropped down to low levels and they're too warm because the atmosphere has warmed them up, then you're not going to be able to cool your power plants. So actually power plants become, based on steam generation, become even more vulnerable under climate change. And yet, if you go to the next slide, thermoelectric power plants, according to the USGS, are the single biggest user of water in the country, more than agriculture. And so for any number of reasons, we should be moving away from burning fossil fuels and uranium. Of course, therefore, this raises the question that none of these problems are insurmountable from a technical perspective. They are all created as a result of the social system that we live under, because we have all the answers. So it's a social and a political problem. And if you go to the next slide, I think the amount of money that these corporations are paying and then getting tax refunds for that is simply stupendous. And if you go to the next slide, that results in the situation that we're all too familiar with that was highlighted by Occupy a year ago. And that is the kind of thing that we need to overcome, because the capitalist answer to crisis is, going to the next slide, cover of the New York Times from last year. What we should really be doing is going out and shopping in order to save the economy. So we need to consume more in order to keep the engine of capitalism growing, because this is a system predicated on relentless expansion. Which really, the opposite way of saying that would be to go to the next slide, and realize that I think we need to move away from capitalism entirely. I don't have any real time to go into some of the things that I was going to say about how we might live, but one of the central aspects, just to mention briefly, one of the central aspects that Marx highlighted that we would have post-capitalism would be vast quantities of time, because the whole purpose of production under socialism, as Marx argued, was to reduce our working time to an absolute minimum, make it meaningful work, and then spend the rest of the time discovering ourselves and investigating the earth, investigating each other, and realizing our own self-worth, not through the things that we buy. I don't think I'm too different from other people, but I'm more connected to my iPhone as a thing than I am to interpersonal relationships that I have with other people. And this is the crazy situation that we end up with under capitalism, that we start valuing things as opposed to each other and relationships that we have with the natural world. We're completely alienated from each other, from our own sexuality, and from the natural world. So we face a triple alienation because we have no control over our own lives in a very real sense. And so we would get back an awful lot of time to investigate things. If you want to laze around sitting on the banks of a river with your free time, then that would be a good use of your time, potentially. Under capitalism, of course, even to sit down and enjoy a meal with somebody is a waste of time, right? It's just a way of getting some chemical energy into your body in order to go and do the next task. We're all crushed under this system. And so, what would we do if we lived in a society not based on competition, not based on a lack of real democracy, not based on production for profit, which are the three things that really drive capitalism, but based on three alternatives. Real democracy, where we are the ones who are having a say, based on production for need rather than production for profit for the things that we need. And then finally, a system not based on competition but on cooperation, where we cooperate to decide collectively what we need. What kind of world would we live in under that system, and what could we be capable of? Why do we need individual things to own? When you think about cars, individual car ownership cars are crazy in the first place anyway, but owning your own car when 90% of the time the car is not moving, right? So even when it's just sitting there and then you have to build all of the concrete. When you think about New York and how much space is taken up by cars, this city is built for cars, not for people. Imagine a city transformed where you extracted all the cars, not even the ones that are moving and killing us, but the ones that are just parked, right? What would you replace parking lots? What could we replace parking lots with? Why does everybody need their own washer and dryer? Any number of things. You could go on and on and on to collectively think about how we could reimagine green spaces everywhere, or not owning things. How many times have you ever heard anybody complain about libraries? It's like goddamn libraries. They give you books for free. It's like a terrible thing, right? Nobody complains about libraries. Why can't we extend that kind of concept to the whole of human nature? We're so alienated that people may know that treadmills, right, in the 18th and 19th century, if you were the lowest of the low, the poorest of the poor, you couldn't get jobs anywhere. You were homeless, you were a vagabond, you got arrested, you were sent to a treadmill to walk and run until you dropped in order to turn some machine to get something to work. Now, we're so alienated from ourselves, treadmills are what you pay to do to go and get exercise in a gym. How crazy is that? So how could we reinvent the whole of the way in which we view things? And ultimately, we need to create some level of organization too, because it's pretty clear, I think, and I'm prepared to stand by the fact that we will get almost nothing out of the Obama administration that we don't fight for over the next 4 years, in the same way that we would have had to have done it under a Romney administration, because we need to form our own organizations. And that is really the crux of the matter, because we really are running out of time. And so the power of scientific rationality, the power of the natural world as expressed by Sandy, none of these things are enough to get them to change course, right? It doesn't matter the size of the disaster or how many things are going wrong. There will be other sections of capital that will find a way to make money from it, disaster capitalism. So there is only one social power that is strong enough to overcome capitalism, I would argue. And it's lain dormant for far too long. And it's time to start getting it organized. Now, of course, in 2011, we've started to see around the world a new era of rebellion and revolt coming to the fore all across the world, which broke out in this country too with Occupy, and will re-emerge. It is inevitable that it will re-emerge. And for that, not only do you need some level of anger, but you need to get together and you need to plan and you need to organize, which means you need an organization.